I'm Penny Muse Abernathy. I'm the night chair here in Journalism and Digital Media Economics. I know most of you in the room, but they don't know you at all. So when you ask questions, I would like for you to just tell you what your name is and what your major is, and whether you're a graduate or undergraduate student. That'll just help them from all of that. So we're really pleased today to have two Pulitzer Prize winning war correspondents in the room. And I'm really pleased to have known both of them in a different life and a different path. So most of us go into journalism because we think we want to be an eyewitness to history and tell others about it, and pretty soon we figure out how much stomach we really have in witnessing things. For me, it took one session at the assignment at the police beat on a Saturday night to realize I had no stomach for carnage, and went over to something like politics, which the blood was only figurative, not literal. These two took a very different path. David and I were actually in class together here at Chapel Hill. We're not going to say which year, but he was the Daily Tar Heel sports editor.
That's right.
And I must say, the other night after the Duke Carolina game, I really wanted to read what David would have said about that last split-second shot. Chris and I met. We actually our paths crossed in Dallas, but he worked for the competition, and he was always in Latin America covering the wars down there. And we actually met a few days before he shipped out to cover the first Gulf War at the New York Times. And I was telling him just coming over here that I remember our conversation very clearly. It was very mundane, very administrative. We talked about the equipment he would need. Chris had a ton of experience by then on what kind of equipment you needed if you were a reporter. And I remember him mentioning he was going to need a Land Rover. That Land Rover became very important about what, I don't say 30, 40 days later, the end of the Persian Gulf War. Chris is riding in the Land Rover and gets captured for 2 weeks by Iraqi soldiers, in which in the book he has written War, the Force That Gives Us Meaning. He talks pretty powerfully about what it's like to starve and be under fire constantly. So Chris is here tonight talking over the PlayMakers on the notion of his own journey through war and the moral and philosophical implications he got from all of that. But what they want to do right now is David's going to start it off with a question maybe to Chris, and then the rest of it is up to you as to where you want to take this for the evening. So thank you both for being here, and I'm turning it over to David.
Okay. Now, are they going to introduce themselves first or afterwards?
Afterwards. When they ask a question, that'd be
I
great.
see. Okay, great. Maybe I can ask Chris about how his feelings about war and combat changed from when he first, I guess South America, Latin America is where you first went. How they evolved over time to the point where, from your readings, you have some pretty strong feelings about war and what it does to people.
Well, I think war is, when you do it long enough, it becomes an addiction, and it's why as soon as one war ended, we were all sitting around figuring out how we were going to get to the next one. I covered the war in Kosovo 20 years after I covered the war in El Salvador, and there were two reporters there who I'd been with during the war in El Salvador. It is possible to hate war and yet become wedded to the experience and unable to cope outside of that experience. It's very difficult for war photographers and war correspondents to adjust when they leave war zones, which is why they keep going back. And for me, I did it a really long time, and it was just, I physically and emotionally just sort of broke down in Kosovo. I mean, I still was able to do it. I went out and did it. I grit my teeth and I did it, but and then, like a lot of war correspondents, I stopped doing it and I couldn't adjust, and I went back like a moth to the flame, and I got caught in a very bad ambush in Gaza at a place called Netzarim Junction. I don't know if you've been there. And there was a kid, a Palestinian kid, about 19 years old, shot through the head and killed about 10 feet away from me, and his companions each one picked up an arm or a leg, and we're running down the road with this body while we're being shot at, and I just realized, I had to stop. But I think that adjustment for me, and I that's really what I did is war. That adjustment for me was one that took 3 years of pulling my life together, and it was a very difficult 3 years with all of the things that, the sort of the drinking and everything else that people do to cope, all the bad things they do to cope. I don't know if you saw the movie The Hurt Locker, but they opened with a quote from my book, that war is a drug. And I think that's right. I think at once one's appalled by what happens, and yet when you do it as long as I did, it becomes really difficult to free yourself from it.
Yeah, I've had the same experience. I think I'm one of those people you talk about who's addicted without really wanting to admit it, but I find when I come back, I haven't been based overseas for a while. What I do is I go over, and cover things for 5 weeks or so and come back, which is not probably the best way to commit journalism. But I find when I get back, the adrenaline just drains, and I'm just irritable, I'm bored. I mean, no story can match just the drama of what's in one. I find myself, like Chris, just having to go back. So I keep telling myself, I'm getting too old for this, and I really should stop. There's the self-preservation motive. I've made it so far, over 30 years, and came out without any serious injuries, and you have to wonder when your number's up, because I see it happen to my colleagues, and I've seen it happen to soldiers, and especially civilians. And to me, what war does to ordinary human beings who aren't participants or combatants is really the hard part to take. In Afghanistan, I spent probably 3 months going around from village to village to 25 villages that had been hit by U.S. aircraft, and took the story that the U.S. puts out, that, oh no, we didn't kill any civilians, or if we did, it was incidental, we were going after Taliban, and found out in almost every village it was a completely different story. That there may have been Taliban at one time, but not at the time that the bombs hit, and that what was hit was civilians, and found over and over again that local Afghans who had a grudge against someone would name that person as a Taliban, and the American forces wouldn't always verify it and would hit it, and it would be an innocent person. But despite that, I keep going back. Most of us got in this business to be at the center of events, at important events, and I want to be there at important events, and there are not many more important events as far as the U.S. is concerned as the war that ended in Iraq. I was just there in December, and the war in Afghanistan. I want people to know about it, and that's why I go back. But I have misgivings, just like you did.
I should add that when I covered the war in El Salvador, when I first got there, the death squads were killing between 800 and 1,000 people a month. And it was exactly the same kind of phenomena, where they denounce the guy who had the rival fruit stand down the street as a member of the rebels, and they'd come in the middle of the night and rape his wife and kill. I mean, that's what happens when you don't have any kind of real native intelligence. You have to remember that in places like Afghanistan, we rely on informants who are the sleaziest, most untrustworthy, and they have the capacity to, in essence, call in an airstrike on a village they don't like. And that's a phenomena that I certainly saw in war after war.
Yeah, one officer, U.S. officer, was talking to me about that, and he said the problem with the Afghans, you can buy them, but they don't stay by. They'll flip to the other side. I mean,
well, people who will sell themselves, are very fickle in terms of their loyalties. That's true in every conflict I covered, and unfortunately, when you come in as an occupying power, those are the only people that are going to work with you.
Exactly.
And you're really at their mercy, and so many people die needlessly because everything is filtered through this very disreputable group of people who are collaborators with the occupying powers. The same was true, by the way, in the occupied territories. I don't know if you covered Palestine at all, but there was a whole class of Palestinian collaborators who worked with the Israelis, and it was exactly the same phenomenon.
Any questions on that topic, or any other things you want to ask about?
My name's Alvin Backman. I'm a reporting major. I guess my question would be like, how does, when you cover, wars and stuff, and you deal with like the U.S. on a completely different level than you would at home, like how does it affect your perspective when you get back?
You want to take it?
Well, you understand the lie, and I think the article that you did was evidence of that, that the official narrative very rarely matches the real narrative. And I think the really great reporters, in my mind, care not about news, but care about truth. And if they care about truth, it gets them in trouble with management, who, you rise within these institutions because you're a good careerist. And there's always a tension in newsrooms because you need good reporters, and yet the really good reporters are management problems because their loyalty is not to their career. Their loyalty is to their reader or their viewer, and they want to tell them the truth. So, you take Sidney Schanberg, who comes back from Cambodia after winning the Pulitzer. They made the movie The Killing Fields about it, and he goes after the developers. He's put on the Metro desk, and he goes after the developers who are all friends of the publisher and how they're essentially forcing low-income people out of Manhattan. They've now largely ethnically cleansed Manhattan of anybody who isn't pulling in a few $100,000. And he won't let up on it, and he won't take a hint. And he's pushed out of the paper. I think I can cite many examples, and you probably can too. Those for me are the really great reporters, the people who care about truth. And when you spend as long as I did, I spent 20 years outside the United States, and I didn't come back. I mean, I may have come back for a week to visit, but I lived overseas. I was based overseas. So for me, the lies that not only that were told, but that were believed, and are still believed, by the mass of American citizens is really deeply alienating. I mean, I give a small example. I taught at Princeton. I've taught at a few places. I taught at the University of Toronto last year, but I've taught at Princeton. And I had a dinner with several professors who I know and who I've taught with, and the subject of the war in Afghanistan came up. And now these people are all consider themselves, good sort of traditional liberals. And they talked about how wonderful it was that we were going in and liberating the women of Afghanistan. None of them have been around explosive devices like Hellfire missiles or TOW missiles or, the whole idea that you can speak about human rights once you employ ordinances of this size around civilian population is an absurdity. And I think that it was deeply upsetting for me. It was really more than upsetting. I was sitting there speaking as I am, speaking to you, trying to speak rationally about the experience of war, the reality of war, and yet the deeper the argument got, the more it unconsciously tapped very disturbing visual images that all of us who have been to war carry. And it wouldn't be wrong to say that by the end of the dinner I was almost hallucinating, where on the one hand I was trying to maintain a discussion, and yet, what they had invoked was a kind of hysteria, which can't be conveyed, finally. And so even from those people who you might traditionally consider to be allies within the wider culture, even to them you cannot communicate. And I think the hardest thing for me, for coming back, is that inability to communicate the evil of empire. When you've been on the outer reaches of empire and understand what it does and how it works and how brutal and deadly it is, especially to the weak and the innocent, and come back with a naive American public that has an image of themselves as being good and virtuous, the disconnect is so vast that you just choose not to even engage. That's certainly been my experience.
Now, you asked about dealing with the military. The military and a lot of institutions will spin you, will shade the truth, and in some cases out and out lie, and they're trying to play you. In the case of the U.S. military in Afghanistan, a lot of them are self-deluded. They believe the spin and they believe the lies because these guys are sitting on bases pushing out press releases. They don't have a personal knowledge of what happened. It's come through 3 or 4 different layers. So when you go to them and say, there was a strike on this village and the village mayor says this many civilians were killed and there were no Taliban there, all he knows is what came up through the chain of command. He has not talked to the guy on the ground. When I was based in Lebanon right after the Israeli invasion, if you recall, the U.S. had troops there. There was an international peacekeeping force, and the Marines were at the airport, and occasionally, well, not more than occasionally, were getting fired on by Shiite and Druze militias, and they weren't supposed to fire back unless they were fired on, and we had U.S. Navy ships out off the coast, and I lived in an apartment that looked right off the coast. One night, I got blown out of bed by a ship firing, and I looked at, and yep, that's a U.S. ship they're firing. I called down to the Marines, to their public affairs, and I said, "Oh, why is the ship firing?" "Oh, there are no ships firing." They out and out lied, said there aren't any ships firing. I said, "Well, you better double check. I think they are." Called up to the command. It came back down. No ships firing. Well, I had written down the I don't know what you call the number on the ship tail. Whatever the number is, I'd written the number of the ship. "Well, what about ship number so and so?" There was a long pause. I said, "Let me check it." And of course, he comes back and says, "Oh yeah, we weren't aware of that, but it really was." But the point is, you really have to confront them, get your facts, but without going out and seeing what's happening, being out every day, you're not going to have the facts to challenge them.
Well, I.F. Stone said, all governments lie. That's true. All people in power lie. I don't really care what their political persuasion is. That's just why when I covered the conflict in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I lived in Gaza. Because when something happened, if I didn't go see it, you were just spun right and left. And you're spun by the Palestinians and the Israelis were more adept at it, but you were spun by both sides. I remember a famous story we covered where, on the Palestinian side, they claimed that the Israelis were trying to bulldoze people to death. Well, it turned out, because I was there, it wasn't really true. It was pretty horrible enough. I mean, the Israelis are very callous in terms of the occupation and will shoot, anybody, including kids. But you have to be there. And so I, as a reporter, always wanted to be there. I never wanted to go to press conferences. In the first Gulf War, I don't think I ever interviewed anybody above the rank of Lance Corporal. I was with 1st Battalion, 1st Marines. I want to be there. And I'm not interested in the spin. I'm not interested in writing the thumb-sucking lead-all, which Johnny Apple, talk about Falstaff, was doing. I love Johnny, too. I mean, Johnny was actually my great protector. But that was me as a reporter. I mean, I was very, very specific about what I wanted to do, and my problem with the New York Times came when I returned to the newsroom, and I think that traditionally war correspondents never fit back into institutions because if you think about it, what are we paid to do? We're paid to defy authority. Not only are we paid to defy authority, we're paid to defy authority that's trying to kill us. And so we are just really bad at coping. And when I came back to the Times, and I'd never worked in the Times, I'd been in the Middle East when I was hired for the Dallas Morning News. I speak Arabic, which is why. I mean, usually the Times grooms you so that by the time they let you out of the building, they've had 10 years to beat you down and makes you completely compliant to the institution. And when I came back in, I mean, one of the things that stunned me was how much talent and how much fear. These people were so frightened of the hierarchy, and all they did was sit around and try and figure out which editor was in and which editor was out. It was just a disease. Now, I had really bad PTSD, and I was like a rabid dog. I mean, I walked into the newsroom and they said, "There's your desk," and I said, "Give it to someone else. If you think I'm sitting in this newsroom, you're out of your fucking mind." I mean, that kind of stuff, which was, number one, a career killer, but number two, it meant that at least while I was there, everyone left me alone.
Chris, could you go a little bit more into that? So you left the Times and after you were reprimanded for having given a commencement speech in Rockford College in Illinois, in which you basically came out with an editorial stance, let me put it that way. So what prompted you surely knew by then what was going to happen, so what prompted you to do that? And David, have you ever had a similar situation where you had a choice of what to do? So, I mean, because in essence what you've hit on is the objectivity or the what you're supposedly reporting on was something that you walked across.
I think objectivity is really the excuse for institutions to take a moral pass on what they should be doing. You know, it wasn't, you know, I spent 7 years in the Middle East and months of my life in Iraq, and I realized, you know, based on experience, that everything being told to the American public to justify the war was bullshit. Now, I also knew that getting up and saying that was like slitting my own wrists in terms of my career. But without being melodramatic, as it turned out, I've lost friends in this war, as I knew I would. And, the idea that we would be greeted as liberators, or that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East, or the oil revenues would pay for the reconstruction, or that Saddam Hussein was a threat to his neighbors, much less to us, were utter absurdities. These were true statements, and they weren't based on opinions. They weren't editorial statements from my point of view. They were based on factual observation. I mean, I covered the UN inspection teams that destroyed, Saddam did have stockpiles of chemical and biological agents that he stored in artillery shells, and I covered that. I was in the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the paper and watched them all be destroyed. His army was a rusted hulk by the Second Gulf War. And yet to get up and say this, and I think that what I found that even the people who knew it, and anybody who came out of the Middle East knew it, they didn't say it because they knew the career consequences of it. And I think that's the difference. I cared about truth, and I really never gave a damn about my career, but that was never the point. I didn't go to El Salvador to cover the war to build my career. I went to El Salvador because it was an egregious assault against innocent human beings that, the Reagan administration was lying about, and that a good reporter would tell the truth about at great cost. 22 of my colleagues were killed when I was there. And I think that's the difference. I was a freelance reporter in El Salvador, and the Washington Post offered me a staff job. But the deal was I had to go back to some suburb in Maryland, and I said, I came to cover the war. I'm not going to go take it's not about rising within the Washington Post. And I turned the job down, even though I had no, permanent employment, even though I was freelance. So I think for me that was always the driving factor. And I think the great tragedy for me of institutions like the Times is that I think they do draw tremendous amounts of talent, but it is the most fear-ridden institution I've ever been in, and really unhealthy in that sense. I was talking to Cy Hirsch about it, who, I don't know if you know Cy's work, but Cy was briefly there too. And I think that's right, and I think that again, we'll go back to that idea that good reporters tell the truth, but if you do tell the truth, don't expect you're going to be rewarded for it. You're not.
David, how about you?
Well, I'll give you an example of how the truth can get perverted by repetition. During the invasion in 2003 in Iraq, I was there along with hundreds of other journalists being embedded with the troops, and I wanted to get at the essence of what's this war all about. So I would ask the troops, why are you here? And I was amazed. Either they couldn't tell me, they had no clue, or they would say it was because we were attacked in 9/11. To a man, and that just spread through. They would have pictures of the Twin Towers on their vehicles, 9/11, never forget, and they were convinced that Saddam Hussein was behind or had something to do with the attack on 9/11. That's disturbing enough. Last December, I was in Iraq and Kuwait covering the final troops coming out, and I asked the same question again. And really, the answers were not that much different. There are still a lot of these guys who think it was because terrorists attacked us, and we've got to prevent, the terrorists from attacking us again in the U.S. And this is Iraq, not Afghanistan.
Students go first.
My name is Rima Grace. I'm a senior, majoring in electronic communication. And I'm just curious, I had a wonderful opportunity this past summer to report and to document stories in Cairo. So I spent a lot of my days in Tahrir Square. It was a really great experience, but I think the one thing that surprised me the most was how naive I was about the entire process. As far as it's like, oh, well, I know the language, I know people there, they'll be fine, but I realized it's a much more patient process, and I was only there for a month, which pales in comparison to the work that you all did. But I'm just curious how long it took you all, once you were actually in the respective countries, wherever you were, to really understand what was going on, and to, I mean, I know it's so complex. I remember one day I'd talk to someone and he would tell me something, and then the next day I'd be told an entirely different story. And so I'm just curious, like, at what point do you feel confident enough and you feel like equipped enough to tell the right stories? And I mean, does it take years, months?
Yeah, a while. My first foreign assignment was to move to Beirut right after the Israeli invasion, when the international peacekeeping forces came in, and I really felt it took a year before I had some solid sense of what was going on, and that was day after day after day of going out every day, getting in the car with a driver and interpreter and just going out and talking to everybody possible. And I really wasn't well prepared. I worked at a paper, the Philadelphia Inquirer, that didn't have a foreign staff and was sent there. Overnight, we created 6 foreign bureaus that we'd never had before. I tried to read everything I could in history and current events in the month or so I had to get ready, and tried to take a quick Arabic class and really didn't pick up much because I didn't have the time. So I was really strapped, and I had to really, really work hard. But I did apply some of the same principles that you learn as a police reporter or covering courts or covering institutions. You've got to be there, you've got to meet as many people as you can, you've got to get to where things are happening, ask questions, don't believe everything you're told, be skeptical. So to answer your question, it was a good year, and after 2 years there I felt like I was pretty well versed.
I think that's right. I think it takes a year of full-time work before you can even begin to comprehend what's going on. I worked really hard to learn languages. When I left Central America, the Dallas Morning News, I didn't want to leave Latin America. I speak Spanish, and just wanted to go to South America. After 5 years in the war in El Salvador and Nicaragua, sit around Argentina and drink wine. And they didn't want to open a bureau there, so they offered me London or Jerusalem, and I accepted Jerusalem with a caveat that I take time. They give me a sabbatical to study Arabic, which they did. So language is key. I did not speak Serbo-Croatian, which I think was a huge handicap during the war in Bosnia. When I found out I was going, I was in Cairo. Well, I volunteered to go. As Joe Lelyville, the former editor, said, the line starts and ends with you. There had been 45 journalists killed by the time in Sarajevo. And so I started Serbo-Croatian. I found somebody who knew the language in Cairo, but then the ceasefire broke down and the correspondent who was there didn't want to keep covering it. He didn't want to go back into Sarajevo. Sarajevo was really the most dangerous place I was ever in. 2,000 shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day. It was really, and these were really heavy pieces of ordnance, 155 howitzers, which if you don't, these are just like shells like this, Katyusha rockets, 90 millimeter tank rounds. So I left without it, and I think that my coverage in Bosnia really suffered because of that. But I think most foreign correspondents would tell you a year of daily reporting on the ground before you can even begin to understand.
And that's not 5 days a week, that's every single day.
Well, right.
When you're posted overseas, you're working every
sometimes
day.
you're writing 2 stories a day. You're writing a news story, you're writing a news, because it's a little better at the LA Times, but the New York Times runs a wire service.
Right.
I mean, that competes with AP. So, I mean, you have to cover everything. I mean, it was just brutal. And I think like a wire service reporter, one of the major prerequisites, I mean, they had chosen me to cover the war in Bosnia over a freelancer, Chuck Sudetich, who's a really fine reporter, but Chuck just couldn't churn it out. I mean, I can write the way an AP reporter writes. I write fast, I write clean. And in a way, although Chuck clearly, when he speaks the language, was far superior in terms of his understanding without question. And his book, Blood and Vengeance, I think was the best book written on the war. What the paper wanted, in the end, was somebody who could function like a wire service. And so, yeah, the workload was staggering, really staggering.
And one point on language is if you get a chance, learn as many foreign languages as you can. When I went to school here, I was goofing off and really didn't pay attention. I took Spanish and didn't pay attention, and I wish I had learned at least one foreign language, and wish I knew the native languages of the places I go. It's a real detriment. You have to work really hard to get around it, and even with an interpreter, translator, you just miss so much, because you don't pick up the stuff that people don't think, when people don't think you're listening or just observing and overhearing things, you don't get that.
It's even
you're
worse.
Really reliant.
It's worse, because when you go into a really dangerous situation, like let's say Gaza, if you have a translator, I saw this repeatedly because not a lot of American journalists speak Arabic, the translator's family lives there. And if Hamas is like down the street doing something dirty, they know that if they take you there, or if they tell you about it, or even if you interview somebody who tells you about it and they translate it into English, there's a knock on their door, at night. And so when you get into extremely volatile situations, you really have to have the language. It's because it's going to be because you're putting the danger to your interpreter, who is left behind after you leave, is so immense. That most of them are not going to let you see or hear, just for their own self-preservation. The other problem is that internal security is going to use them, in essence. Even there's really no way out of it. They're going to want to know who you saw, where you're going, and so language gives you a kind of power. I did a piece for National Geographic out of Egypt. It's a long story. It never actually ran. They came to me and said, we want to have a piece on the real Egypt. Are you from Egypt?
I'm Palestinian. I'm from Gaza, actually.
Okay. Oh, really?
Yeah, my family's.
I said, no, you don't want to hire me. I'd just done a piece in Harper's on Han Yunis. I don't know if you ever saw it, A Gaza Diary. Anyway, got me in a lot of trouble. And
Again.
I went and lived in Han Yunis for 10 days. I didn't interview any PA officials, Palestinian officials. I didn't interview. I just day in and day out. And I was there when the Israelis were like shooting 10-year-old kids. I watched it and I wrote it, and I went to the hospital, in a few cases their funerals, and it just exploded. Anyway, so National Geographic, they don't want to hear all these little stories. Anyway, so they come to New York and they say, we want you to go. No, they say, we National Geographic, which by the way prides itself on writing at a 7th grade level, it really is the worst written schlock. The photos are great. And so they said, no, we want to have an edge. We want you. I said, okay. So I go to Egypt, and I went to southern Egypt. I wanted to write about poverty, so I went and lived in a village. I got Jahardia while I was there, where they make mud bricks, and they have for generations, and they sell it. And I wanted to write about the real Egypt, not Luxor and the Giza pyramids, but Egypt is an appallingly poor country. 50% of the people live on less than $2 a day, and I wanted to show it. And when the Muhabarat, or the secret police, found out I spoke Arabic, they went completely berserk. Because for this reason, they couldn't set up a filter to stop me from understanding what was happening. And so I was with a great Iranian photographer, Reza, if you know him. He's really famous, really cool guy. Anyway, and he speaks Farsi, but he knows Arabic too. It just got comical. Like, we wanted to go out to the cane fields, and we're leaving, and there's a police roadblock, and they won't let us through, and won't let us through, and won't let us through. Finally, after like 2 hours, they let us through, and we get out to the cane fields, and every single cane worker is like new jeans and Ray-Ban sunglasses. Yeah, it was like that. They like gotten rid of all the workers, pulled in the secret. It got to that level. But that's a good example of why you want the language, because you just pick. You not only don't you can actually report, but you always pick stuff up. Translators never translate the most important thing. It's that little aside. It's that little.
Yeah, you have to ask.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm a big believer in, really, and look, I'm not any gifted linguist. I used to be an athlete in college. I got an athletic scholarship to college, and it's just like that. It's like going to practice every day. You just got to get up and like learn the verb declensions. It's awful, but it's like you got to do it. And the idea that you pick it up in the street is just wrong. You have to study. I mean, like with the Arabic, I did 4 hours a day. I did 160 hours of Arabic. It was all tutoring, and even then, my Arabic, which is pretty deteriorated, wasn't great. It was all right. But you just connect with the culture on so many levels. I mean, culturally, you begin to connect. It's really important.
Well, let me ask you, did you make a point of not letting people in authority know that you spoke the language? I would think that would be a great benefit to have them not know. I think it would have worked to your advantage, wouldn't it?
I don't know that I hit it.
Yeah.
I think like, for instance, when we went to this village, they just assumed it because they weren't prepared.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, the funny story is that they took the story, and if you can ever get a gig with National Geographic, do it. I'll never get another one. They paid $20,000,
Wow.
which is the most I've ever been paid for a story. And so it's all laid out in the galleys, ready to go. And the television division reads it and freaks out and goes, if we print this story, we'll never film another special on King Tut. And that's where they make their money. And they yanked it. They didn't print it.
Oh.
And I went down there, and they tried to screw around with my Kilfie. And that's when having post-traumatic stress disorder really comes in. And I walked in that office, and I looked like I was going to leap over the desk, and I might have. And they just wrote that check really fast. But I mean, that's a window into how these institutions work. I mean, I think that the real credo of the New York Times or any commercial news organization is do not significantly alienate the people on whom you depend for access and money. You can do it sometimes, but not all the time. And good reporters do it all the time. Sidney Shamberg says, and I was talking to Sidney a while ago in New York, and he was saying, I mean, we both lament, and we were talking earlier, but we lament the demise of these institutions, but we don't want to, without fear and favor, and, this is just garbage. But Sidney said, and we're all terrified. I mean, we're watching the Philadelphia Inquirer maybe go dark. I mean, nobody's going to be there to cover courts. Nobody's going to cover, I mean, it really is catastrophic for our democracy. And yet we don't want to be Pollyannish about the failings of these institutions. But as Shamberg said, it's not so much maybe that these institutions made things better, but they stopped things from getting worse. And I think for me, that is the benefit of.
I'm Victoria Still. I'm a senior here at Journalism and Economics double major, and I was wondering how you guys deal with management that is like that, and how you kind of lead without authority. Do you basically have to just leave an institution like that altogether? Is there any way that you can kind of work your way through it and get people?
Oh no, he still has a job, so
Yes.
he can give you the
Well,
tips
I
on
deal
that.
with some editors, not too many, but some who think they know the story before you get there, and that drives me crazy. And I've been an editor, and I never told a reporter what I thought the story was going to be. I said, go there and find out what the story is. And when I go someplace, I don't have a set idea of what the story is going to be. I know general areas and topics that I want to cover, but I don't know how it's going to turn out. And there are editors who will say, well, can you write me a schedule, a budget of what your story is going to be? And it's so hard to explain to them, like, I don't know what the story is going to be. But they sort of live on this production line where a story is just a widget that's on the line, and you plug it in, and it has to be defined before you get there. Luckily, at the paper I work for, the LA Times, the foreign desk, really the editors are very good, and they don't do that, and they leave me completely independent. I come up with my own stories. They rarely assign a story. The other problem, though, I have had, and at other papers too, is if your story is different from the AP or from what other
Or the New York
papers
Times.
have, or the New York Times, it drives them crazy, and they are really terrified. You've got to really prove it to them and sell it to them. Like, no, I was there, I saw this. It is true, and they usually make you go back. Well, go back and check with your sources because AP is running this, or the New York Times has that. And you just, if you believe in your story, you gotta stand up for it.
That's the problem with having a lousy reporter for the New York Times. I mean, because they're just publishing one piece of garbage after another, and if you're not at the Times, which I wasn't in Central America. I mean, we had one reporter whose name will go unspoken, who never left the hotel.
Yeah, there are guys like
And and Salvador, you didn't get that war unless you were out there hoofing it, sleeping on the ground with the FMLN and there were a few of us. Miami Herald had really good people. Who was the LA Times? I can't remember.
it was before I got there.
And we were just, it was a nightmare because if, the New York Times story was just the latest embassy handout. So, that's a real pressure. And the really good reporters are going to get it out and get the story that others didn't get. It is easier. You have other problems with the Times. I mean, the Times opens a lot of doors. It's a very powerful, I don't know how much it is now. I guess things are declining, but it's a very powerful institution, and it can work to your advantage. It can work to your disadvantage in that, what you write has so much impact. I mean, I'll give you an example. I did a story in Bosnia about corruption, and corruption was just rampant. This was after the war ended. And so the U.S. sent in some former FBI agents to sort of try and find out, the Bosnians were just stealing money right and left. And they produced this 400-page report that documented it. And I interviewed these two people, and they showed it to me, which they shouldn't have done. So I wrote this huge story, the front page of the New York Times, about, just all the scams. Like, for instance, these 3 gangsters set up a bank, just created a bank in Sarajevo. I mean, anybody could, everything was destroyed. And got AID to give them like $30 million, and then they just took off for Rio or something. It was that kind of stuff. So I printed it, and everybody, it was during the Clinton administration, everyone freaked out. So what they did is the State Department would hold briefings based on my story, and it was so sleazy. They'd say, well, first of all, there was no report. So my foreign editor, it was Andy Rosenthal, freaks out and calls them up and says, but he says he saw 400. It's not a report, it's a document. But see, what had already gone out on the wires is that State Department denies existence of report in New York Times. And they said, it's totally untrue that this bank took $30 million of AID money. So the New York Times freaks out and calls them up, and they're saying, well, we're still hoping to get it back. It was and it's that game that they'll take you down. So when you go, and especially institutions like the Times, even if you're right, what they really hate is controversy. A really good way to build a career at that institution is to be right down the middle of the road. Don't keep pushing the edges like that, because even when you're right, which I was, it became a huge headache for the institution. Because in the public sphere, the name of the institution was being sullied, and of course I was being attacked. And the other thing that is quite real is that when you get out there as a reporter and you push and push, they'll go after you. Reagan clearly the Reagan administration had clear names in the war in Salvador Ray Bonner being high on the list, but there were others of us that they just wanted our careers destroyed. And I was also on that list. I had written a story about, actually AID again, had given all sorts of aid, and the Army to civilians, food aid. The Army had taken it in this town and was selling it in the market. And I actually had a picture of it being sold in the market, this kind of stuff. And so then they just decided that I was a headache and they were going to get rid of me. And they I was working for the Christian Science Monitor, and you ever run into a guy named Tex Harris?
Mm-hmm.
This amazing diplomat. He had been the number 2, the DCM at the embassy in Argentina. Tex Harris?
In the Argentina film?
Oh, well, this was, maybe he was in the film. He was smuggling like people who they were trying to disappear in the trunk of his car with diplomatic plates to Uruguay. That's my kind of diplomat.
Yeah.
And so Tex obviously never became an ambassador because he actually had a conscience. And they ship him off to AID. And he's in the office when they're trying to destroy me. And he called up my editor at the Christian Science Monitor, David Annable, who later became the editor, and said, I just want to tell you, everything this guy wrote is true, and they're trying to destroy him. So I've never even met Tex. I actually, when I got back to the States, I thought, well, there's somebody I should send a thank you letter to, which I did. But boy, those are the games they'll play. So if you go out there and you defy officialdom, which a good reporter does, you're going to have to battle not only the institution you work for, but very powerful forces that seek to blunt those messages.
Can you talk, I don't know if you were at the times when they got in trouble over the weapons of mass destruction.
Of course, I was on the investigative team.
Well,
Yeah, I was
playing
there.
it down the middle, I don't know if you can talk a little bit. That got them in a lot of trouble by not confronting the Bush administration.
Yeah,
playing it
well,
down
I
the
was
middle.
I was covering Al-Qaeda, based in Paris, living at the Hotel de Louvre. If anybody's ever been to Paris, it's not a bad deal. And I was doing, because I speak French, Arabic, and Spanish. I didn't do Germany, but I did Britain, Belgium, the Paris embassy bombing plot. Everything was plotted out of Belgium. France, of course, and then I would do the Middle East. So like the Tunisian, the synagogue bombing, all that stuff I did. So I was in Paris, and so I was part of the investigative team, but I wasn't physically in New York. And there you had the infamous Judy Miller and Michael Gordon and all of these people. And so, having come back and sat in on those meetings, my sense is that they were all true believers. That it wasn't, that they believed what they were told. And for those of us who, the French were pulling their hair out because, and it was good for me in a sense because they were desperately leaking anything to me to try and counter. I had carte blanche I used to go in and ask questions about militants, and he was a Sicilian in the Ministry of Interior, head of counterterrorism, would just order the files. Come, and there'd be the surveillance photos of him at the mosque, and stuff that American intelligence would never let us see, but they were so frustrated over the failure of the Americans to get it, that the issue was not Iraq. They take Al-Qaeda really seriously because of the GIA and the Paris embassy, the Paris metro bombings in the 80s were quite severe, and that was my sense, that there was total incredulity. They didn't even question. They wasn't, and coming back from Paris, when I would raise questions, if you remember, it was sort of de rigueur to make fun of the French. I don't know, you're all too young. But people would make jokes about the French, about French identity, because they would challenge the war idea of going into Iraq. There's a word for it, by the way, it's called racism. And when I would come back from Paris and sit on those meetings, I would be met with exactly that response. Oh, the French, what are and it was just utterly dismissed. So my read on it was that it was, they don't ever underestimate fear as a weapon. It happened in New York. People were scared. Fear works wonders on the fearful. And I think that they, I never sensed, being in those meetings, that they had the kind of either moral or physical fortitude to even challenge the data they were given or ask the right questions. And I think that was because of their emotional state.
Well, they didn't want to burn their sources either. They'd gotten so close. Wasn't that part of it?
Yeah, well, is this like going out on the internet or something? Judy Miller's insane. She was just insane. I'd known Judy for years. I mean, how anybody could like let her, you know, did you ever deal with her?
Yes, I did.
Well, you must second my opinion.
She's
Not
now-
on camera.
she's now
She's
a
too
public
tactful.
commentator.
Hey, this sounds like a good place to remind you, you've got to give another speech in about 35 minutes. So, any wrap-up thoughts from any of you, or anybody got one last question they've been burning to ask? It looks like down there at the end, right? Weren't you asked that question? Yeah, you didn't ask yet, yeah.
I'm Anisha Nelson. I'm an exchange student from London here this semester. I was just wondering, kind of, what was the reaction you got from ordinary civilians in the places you went to? Kind of, how did they react to your presence there as a foreign journalist?
Go ahead.
It depends on the country. It really depends. It's quite dramatically different. You know, sometimes, like for instance in Sarajevo, the Serbs were actively trying to kill us. I mean, they didn't even try and hide it. They thought we were all driving armored cars. I mean, I asked them after the war, why were you trying to kill us? Because we knew the back of your armors were filled with weapons for the. I mean, it was in Latin America. Yeah, it really depends where. I mean, in places like the Congo, have you worked the Congo? I mean, that's scary. Because you got 14-year-old kids on uppers with like AK-47s at a roadblock at dusk. That's really
That's
scary.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it depends. I would say the less central control military authorities have, the more frightening it is.
Right.
Would you agree with that?
Yes. Example, quickly, Libya. I was in Libya last winter and summer, and as you know, the so-called rebels were just students, shop owners, mechanics, educators who had taken over the armories in Benghazi and grabbed all the guns. They knew nothing about guns, and they had some big, heavy weapons that they would mount on these trucks. And the most dangerous thing you could do is go hang out with these guys because they were playing with their guns constantly, didn't know how to use them. Several, I mean, more than several of their own people were killed. And I saw a guy just killed right in front of me, accidentally by a guy trying to clear his weapon. He killed another rebel just right there. A Time magazine woman had a shot go right across her face by a guy who was goofing around with his gun. Anyway.
The problem is when authority doesn't break down. We saw it in Bosnia when you get kind of warlords. Then it like, are you good for kidnapping? I mean, I was kidnapped. I was taken prisoner by the Iraqis, and also by the Contras. And it's like, you know, can they get something for you? And then the problem is that, like, I had two friends of mine who got with the Guatemalan guerrillas, and then the army like was onto them, and these guys, you know, they walked 24 hours a day, and the two journalists couldn't keep up, so they just shot him through the head and killed him, buried him under leaves. I mean, yeah, it depends on the conflict. It depends where. It depends. So I wouldn't say that it was in any way uniform. I would say that for me, speaking the language was really a lot of protection. I mean, when I was a prisoner in Iraq, there were other journalists, but I was the only one who spoke Arabic, and it actually gives you, number one, an ability to understand. Like, for instance, every morning the guards would be listening to Radio Monte Carlo, which is the Arabic service, and I would hear, I would hear in Arabic, the Iraqi government, or, you know, the missing journalists, nobody knows, the Iraqi government says they have no idea where they are. And then I would hear my guards talk about what would happen to us after we'd be turned over to the secret police. And we were turned over to the secret police for the last 24 hours, which was not something I translated for the other journalists since they were already frightened enough. But that's just a little window. And I actually built a very close relationship with one major in particular. I mean, it was really touching. I remember one morning because we were traveling with a light armor battalion. So we were sleeping, there was a lot of fighting, we were ambushed for 16 hours one day. And I woke up one morning on the ground, and he had gotten up, and it was before dawn, and he'd actually I watched him take his blanket and come over and put it on top of my blanket, so I'd have two blankets. It was just the sweetest little thing, in a little moment like that. But that comes through language. It comes through language. Language is power. It's not a cliche.
Chris, they're going to really be sending out a search party for you if
What
I do
time am I
not get
supposed
you
to-
over there. It's
Was it
6
6:30?
o'clock.
What time am I supposed to talk?
6:30. Let me just wrap this up. If you want to hear Chris some more, he's speaking again at 6:30 at the PlayMakers. David lives in Raleigh and is here quite often, and you really ought to avail yourself of hearing David on as many times that he's here from all of this. And I want to end with one other thing, in which I think Farrell and Susan will also confirm. One of the great side benefits of being a journalist and witnessing history is you also get to travel with some very impressive colleagues. And I feel really fortunate to have crossed paths with these people, and I'm glad that you guys got a chance tonight to hear them, if only for a little bit. So thank you guys for coming, and thank you for coming.
Thank you.